Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine put together on the behest of the Tertium Quids and the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Our next guest, as I said, it's an all-Taylor program, is James Taylor. He's the senior fellow with the Heartland Institute, specializing in export and energy production. James, welcome to the program. How are you doing this week, sir?
Oh, thank you for having me on. Doing fantastic.
So much is made, and I guess after a bit it has become almost an offhand comment, and it shouldn't be. I don't think it should be. I think it's fairly stunning considering having grown up through the 70s, that the United States now is an oil, or is it an oil exporter or an energy exporter? Because I've heard it said both ways. I thought it was an oil exporting nation, but then people say, no, you throw natural gas in there and we're exporting even more. And so give us some of the details on that. And am I wrong thinking that from where I was as an adolescent and young adult in the 70s, that this is a pretty stunning thing for the United States to have become?
Stunning is an understatement, because for decades, the dream was that we would get somewhere close to energy self-sufficiency, and it seemed like a pipe dream. Mm-hmm. We had a reliance on OPEC and other oil exporting nations. The United States has always had vast oil resources, but we have put the handcuffs politically on our ability to produce oil. And a couple things have changed recently. The fracking revolution, advances in hydraulic fracturing technology and directional drilling have allowed us to produce much more oil and natural gas on private and state-owned lands. That's the big one that kicked in about a decade ago. And then just recently, in the past 2 years, the Trump administration has removed the shackles imposed by the Obama administration on producing on public lands. And the end result of that is that late in 2018, for the first time, we became a net exporting nation in terms of oil. Hopefully we will continue that, and that our exporting status will grow. And regarding energy as a whole, yes, we are a coal exporter. We are now a natural gas exporter. So we are an oil exporter, and we are an energy exporter as a whole.
Now, here in Central Virginia, there's much controversy. As a matter of fact, the king of global warming hoaxery, Al Gore, was just here in Buckingham County, Virginia, helping the Sierra Club pretend that they've all of a sudden found the Jesus of property rights ownership, when all they really want to do is stop hydraulic fracturing. They can't seem to muster up the courage to just say we want to stop fracking, so we'll stop the pipelines that that come from the fracking, and we'll find some historically black freedmen's colony and go in there and say, but you're poor, why should they build your pipeline through here? And all the different kind of I almost sad, typically political events, but people buy into them. And I guess in this day of social media and everyone's got a camera on their phone, that these sorts of things build traction where in years past they might have just been kind of laughed off, wouldn't they?
Well, that's true, and the environmental left is very clever. So they look for ways to appeal to and undermine people who believe in free markets and limited government. So while certainly as somebody who believes in both of those principles, I am concerned about eminent domain. I am concerned about government saying this is where we're going to place our infrastructure, and too bad if it's your property. But it has to be a standard that applies across the board, because Al Gore and the environmental activists do not apply that same standard to the transmission lines that need to be built across thousands of miles of land to bring wind power and solar power from their remote generating locations to urban centers. They don't apply those standards in terms of, for example, oftentimes we'll hear that, local areas, local governments should have the ability to decide for themselves as a matter of federalism and conservative principles whether they should ban fracking. However, they oppose state laws that would open up fracking and ensure that fracking is available throughout the state. They only appeal to conservatives and conservative principles when they want to restrict individual rights. They never do so when they want to enhance individual rights or restrict government overreach in areas that they support.
But with this, though, we see the opportunity for even less expensive energy generation. And as my 21-year-old son pointed out, the amount of fossil fuels needed to create solar cells and wind turbines is profound as well. So it's not as if they're actually going to get rid of the need for fossil fuels in plastics and things like that in general. So the con job isn't being lost on at least some 20-year-olds and as they grow. I'd like to think that, especially as the energy to charge their iPads and things like that become abundantly clear to the millennial generation, the expense of it, that they would see the sense of inexpensive energy generation coming from a natural product, the hydrocarbons.
Absolutely. And the sun, 12 hours a day, the sun is not shining, plus whatever part of the daylight hours in which we have cloud cover. Wind speeds need to be in a fairly ideal range to generate workable wind power. The problem is not just intermittency, keeping in mind that we don't have battery storage that can take those wind and solar power sources. I mean, you can't even keep your cell phone charged for a day. How are we going to charge a whole city on batteries? But the wind and solar, the energy that's in wind and solar, is not concentrated. It's very diffuse. It's very spread out. Even on the hottest day in Arizona or Florida, you can crack an egg on the sidewalk. It's not going to fry. Therefore, you need tremendous amounts of wind and solar power equipment to generate even small amounts of electricity. And if you're truly concerned about the environment, then you should be concerned about the literally hundreds of square miles of wind turbines that are necessary to replace a single coal or natural gas power plant. Then you should be concerned about the rare earth minerals, which is about the most destructive mining practice that occurs environmentally, that is necessary to produce the rare earth minerals that are necessary for wind power and solar power equipment. And the environmental left wants us to ignore these environmental consequences that are severe and are unique to wind and solar power in their irrational hatred of all things quote-unquote fossil fuel.
There's an international importance to not just that aspect of it, but the oil exporting and supporting our allies that don't have that kind of resource, like Britain or Israel or France, where we can help them also not have to be the slave to the petrodollar and to oligarchs that are in many cases funding the very terrorists that come after our doorways.
Right. And if you look at oil exports, natural gas exports, coal exports, Russia, for example, is leading the world in exports. And what we have an opportunity as a nation to do is remove the dependency of nations upon Russia, and to a certain extent China. These hostile nations, or potentially hostile nations, that have sway in Ukraine, where they're struggling for their independence, where they're struggling for Western democracy, they still have to be very careful because they're dependent upon Russian energy. So is Germany, so is Western Europe, so are many other nations, third world nations. And if we would simply remove the environmental left's handcuffs on our domestic energy production and domestic energy export, because they fight export terminals being built anywhere in the United States, then we would be able to export our views on human rights, on individual liberty, on democracy.
Amen.
Because these nations would no longer fear Russian backlash for falling into America's camp.
And it's not a lost notion to look at Russia's exporting of natural gas especially, but their energy resources as what saved the country from the collapse that was going on at the fall of the Soviet Union. And if anything else, we should be learning that this is a way to support an economy. In their case, it's an economy of soft core communist dictatorship. They've reworked it, put a little lipstick on it. But in our case, we could be, as you said, exporting liberty, freedom, human rights around the world with our gas and oil.
Right. And another economic point is that when oil and therefore gasoline prices go up, American consumers have always felt the pain of that. But there's a reason why nations such as Saudi Arabia, such as Russia, such as Venezuela, why they prefer to have higher oil prices and drive up the prices. Their domestic gasoline prices go up at the same time, but because they export, because they're net exporters, the economy as a whole benefits.
Right.
And allowing American energy producers to produce these vast energy resources we have is an insurance policy such that any time oil prices go up and we feel the pain at the pump, we will have solace knowing that our economy as a whole is benefiting because we are bringing in foreign dollars, which are taxed, which do benefit the American economy, which generate other jobs throughout the economy. So either way we win. Either our gasoline prices go down or, as a whole, our economy benefits.
James Taylor is Senior Fellow at the Heartland Institute on Energy Policy, and you wrote a great piece about one of the cons in the Green New Deal. And maybe at some point, before we finish, I want to get into this idea that we can just go, moonshot, put everybody in there, go, Manhattan Project, and we can figure it out. Versus, one of the more simple breaks you took out of it is the idea of a carbon tax and a revenue-neutral carbon tax, because it's been sold to some conservatives that, look at this, we're inventing our own currency, and we'll buy and sell in carbon tax, and it'll be a whole new way to generate wealth that, everyone can generate wealth based on their carbon footprint and so on and so forth. The whole mythos behind the Chicago Environmental Exchange. Talk about that a little bit, James, this week.
I think it's important to recognize that this is a myth, and the appeal that is presented is, look, we're going to increase carbon dioxide taxes on carbon dioxide emissions, but we'll return them to you in other forms. So, in other words, there is no net drain on your income. There's no net increase in taxes overall. We're just going to shift them around a little. Now, first of all, the environmental left has signaled there's no way they would go for that. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that we could craft such a plan. Here's the problem. You can craft a carbon dioxide tax that is neutral in terms of government revenues, but it will never be neutral in terms of household revenues. So revenue neutral applies only to government. And here's the reason why. The whole point of a carbon dioxide tax is to make currently inexpensive energy sources, coal, oil, natural gas, much more expensive than wind and solar. When that's the case, people will purchase wind and solar power. So you drive up conventional energy prices. People now purchase wind and solar power, which are 3 times or so more expensive than conventional power. Now, when people purchase the wind and solar power, there is no tax being collected because there is no carbon dioxide being generated. So what happens is people spend much more money on their energy bills. Businesses and industry spend much more money on their energy bills, which get passed along to customers, but no tax is being collected. So it can be government revenue neutral, but it will never be household or economy revenue neutral. And that's what's important to keep in mind.
Is it fascinating to you, as somebody who's obviously studied this for a very long time and very seriously, that we found this amazingly creative way, and in a chilling sort of dark Frankenstein creative is what I mean, way to tax passive activity now? We can tax you for not buying insurance. We can tax you for the air you breathe. In Virginia, they're still kicking around the idea of a what they call an impervious surface fee, but is most colloquially known as a rain tax. So if you have a roof on your house, you have to pay a tax. If you don't have a roof, then you're okay. But if you have a tent that you live in, you're probably going to have to pay that because that's impervious surface as well. Even gravel roads are impervious surface by what Virginia wants to do with their rain taxes. That instead of just taxing you on the products you've bought and sold, was like we've done for the last 100 years, or the work you've done, now we found ways to tax you for just being there. It's chilling.
Well, taxation used to be a means of raising revenue, and policymakers would determine whether a straight flat tax or a quote-unquote progressive tax, it taxes incrementally more for the money you make, et cetera. Sales tax, however, would be the best way or fairest way to raise money or most efficient way. And now what's happened is you have the left that is looking to use taxation as a way to take over and dictate policy and people's behavior. And you mentioned the Green New Deal at the outset of that question, and it's no coincidence that Ocasio-Cortez up in New York and now in Washington, D.C., as a socialist, as someone who refuses to disavow Venezuela, as someone who would love to see Venezuela's system of government imposed on the United States, there's a reason why her most prominent, first and foremost priority upon getting into Congress is to enact a Green New Deal. This is the means by which they intend to and realize they're most likely to impose socialism, true socialism, on the United States. And that would be a nightmare for not only the American economy, but for American individual liberty. And we see the first small steps when you see taxation used as a means of controlling or punishing people rather than raising revenue.
James, last couple of minutes we have here, and I appreciate James Taylor from the Heartland Institute. It seems, and I've talked to listeners and friends and supporters that have said it just, it grows tiring because there seems to be wave after wave. We felt after Václav Klaus wrote the wonderful seminal Blue Planet in Green Shackles that, now we have a textbook on it. We can show it. We've debunked Michael Mann and the hockey stick graph, and Al Gore is sort of gone. But they just keep coming back in waves, and it's almost like you're bailing against the tide. I get up every morning knowing that I'm going to keep bailing, but it's got to be tough to keep the enthusiasm among the constitutional conservatives, James, to keep bailing against this. Eventually you feel like, oh my gosh, I give up. You know what? I'm just going to try to be comfortable. Sort of along the lines of what you heard Tucker Carlson say on the show. We conservatives can't keep flogging away at capitalism. We're going to have to start figuring out other ways to be conservative. And it shocked me to hear that, but it was almost like an abandoned ship moment.
It certainly can be an uphill battle, and it can be frustrating, but it's important not to give in to frustration, because those who would take away our freedoms, those who would take away our liberties, those who would impose more and more government restrictions on what we do, all they need to do is win once.
Yeah.
They just win once, and then that imposition, that restriction is put into place, and it's much, much, much harder to remove that imposition, that restriction, than it is to keep it from being put into place in the first place. So even though we're fighting an uphill battle, even though we're fighting against the tide, even though it seems like there will never be an end to defending our freedom against those who would impose government tyranny on us, we have to understand that the battle is so important, and each and every individual battle must be won.
Was it heartening to you to hear the president speak so specifically about socialism during the State of the Union address? That especially as we watch what's happening in Venezuela, and that the president, at least in the executive branch, and hopefully by his direction, the Senate will at least stand up against the House's moves towards some of these things? Absolutely, and it's very encouraging that he was not afraid to take on socialism, which has become. The media controls language. The media uses language to shape narratives that are sometimes far from the truth. So, for example, in the American public's mind, and certainly this is what the Democratic left would like us to believe, socialism is, for example, Sweden. And it's the Western European economies that maybe don't thrive as much as the American economies, but still nevertheless do pretty well. But that is not what socialism is. Socialism is government owning, controlling, dictating the economy and private property and industries, et cetera. It's government ownership, it's government control. It is Venezuela. Now, the Heritage Foundation, for example, they publish their annual review and rankings of economic freedom around the world. So Sweden being the example that's often held up. Look at Sweden. Well, Sweden may have a very generous public safety net and public benefits, but Sweden's economy is more free market than the United States. And so when people say socialism is Sweden and Western Europe, no, it's not. Mm-hmm. Socialism in its truest form, and in the form that the left would like to impose, is Venezuela. It's unavoidable. And nations that simply have a generous public safety net, that is not socialism. And it's very encouraging to hear President Trump call out socialism for what it is, because too many people don't understand exactly what it is, exactly what would happen not only to the American economy, but even more importantly, to Americans' individual liberties and rights when that type of government control is imposed upon the American people. Talk about, in the origination of this country, owning a piece of land, having that liberty, was the cornerstone of our independence. I think our ability to have energy and the power to power the things that we need to use to live our lives inexpensively is another cornerstone that is key to defending liberty. And if we can't afford the electricity we need, that we have no other choice than to become wards of the state. Is that overstating it, or is that kind of where you're coming from with all of the work you do at Heartland?
Well, it's not overstating it, because energy is a factor in the cost of all goods and services bought, sold, and traded in the economy. Not only is it directly impacting us in terms of the electricity bills that we pay or the price of the pump we pay, but when every good and service also has energy as a cost factor, that can drive up or drive down prices. So when energy prices go up, it's like a government tax that's being raised, except when government taxes us, at least theoretically, there's a chance we might get something back in return. When energy prices go up, we don't. When energy prices go down, it's like a tax cut in the sense that we have more money available for the goods and services that we desire. And that's why if you go back 40, 50 years, go back to the dawn of OPEC, what you see is that every time, and I published this chart, Bobby Jindal, when he ran for president, he put out an energy policy, America Next Energy Policy, and I published a chart in that policy paper of his, showing that going back to the early 1970s, every time oil prices go up, immediately and soon thereafter, unemployment goes up. Every time oil prices go down, immediately and soon thereafter, unemployment rates go down. Energy is the key to our economy, and when it's the key to the economy, it's also the key to our individual rights and everything that we do, because when the government controls such an important aspect of our lives, then our liberties are in danger.
What a three-point landing. James Taylor, Senior Fellow at the Heartland Institute. It's been an honor to have you on this week's program, and you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor on my part.
Heartland.org is the website. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. Until next weekend, so long, and thanks for all the fish. Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, a weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. And our first guest, this is actually an all-Taylor edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. We kick off with the legislative advisor for the Tertium Quids, Caleb Taylor, as we wind towards the end of the 400th session of the Virginia General Assembly. Caleb, welcome back to the program. How are you doing, sir?
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So as we get closer to the end of this historic session, I'm sure in 1619 there were not radio shows kind of going over the scorecard, and you didn't have the American Conservative Union giving, vote scores out to members of the House of, I guess, Burgesses at the time. But that said, it seems like at the end, if you only looked at the end product of Virginia's General Assembly session, it's fairly standard. I mean, there's nothing crazy that comes out of it. It was all the stuff that went on before we get to Sine Die that really had gotten everyone's attention. Certainly Kathy Tran's postpartum abortion bill and Governor Northam's defense of it. But at the end of it, most of this stuff went where most of these bills go, into somebody's pocket in a general a work session or committee meeting, but moreover than that, first and foremost, do you share that view that it was a session? And secondly, the concern is that these bills, these kind of crazy bills that were brought up, gun control and that kind of thing, are going to normalize and could be dangerous in years to come as we discuss them more frequently.
I think we will see more of them. And like I said, I think the last time that we spoke about this session, the expectation was this session, at least on the surface, was going to be kind of meh, and that we were going to see, especially after the election, the last election, that the Democrats were going to come out with some really, really strong stuff. What I didn't expect was that the Republicans were going to kind of allow a bunch of these things to get through some subcommittees and committees, which I'm not sure was a effective strategy, but it may be. We'll see in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
but it was, effectively coming down to the idea of the Republicans understanding the position that they're coming up to in the next election and trying to express to everybody, these are the kinds of things that will pass if we lose. And so
I see.
I understand what they're trying to do, and I understand the conversation they're trying to have. I imagine it would have been simply better to get out into the media and say, these are the kinds of things that will pass if we lose.
Yeah, because it certainly gave everyone a stop, and it brought the national media attention, which is always such a good thing in Virginia when the national media comes back. At least they weren't in Charlottesville this time. That said, I was of the mind to a small degree that a lot of the Republicans, if not necessarily the conservatives, are concerned about the redistricting. So therefore, things would pass through knowing that they'd get killed in the other house, but then that the delegate or the senator could go back to a more centrist or a less partisan drawn district and still manage to survive till the next session. Do you think any of that weighed on any of our delegates or senators this session, is that they could be facing a radically different electorate come the next time, or come later this year in November?
Yeah, I think we have seen a little bit of that. I am, happy to report that some of our, I say our very loosely, not in terms of party, but more in terms of just ideologically understandable, champions were, very strong, stayed very strong in their own corners, Freitas and whatnot. Very excited about, very excited about the debates that are inevitable between Tina Freitas and Hanger in the upcoming election. That's going to be really fun to watch.
Well, he hasn't even announced whether he's going to seek the nomination. I happen to point out to somebody, and you imply from this what you will, he was already in his first year in the General Assembly when Ralph Northam's yearbook picture was taken. So, determine whatever that means. Yeah, whatever that means. But yes, it will be interesting to see, because Emmett has certainly legislated as somebody who is got what do they say about the one-handed economist, that you can't say in one hand this and in the other hand that. But as a champion, certainly for Medicaid expansion, which we've covered a dozen times on this program, is both costing more and doing less than even the wildest warnings could have been sounded over it, Caleb, and yet no fix yet for it.
I agree. I have. There have been a couple of times that I've seen Emmett Hanger stick to his guns on things that he absolutely, I believe that he probably shouldn't have. And I have respect for him for finding something that he believes in and staying with it no matter what, whether that was he believes in his career or he just believes in Medicaid. Maybe he does. I don't want to pretend I know the inner workings of anybody else's mind. I just tend to disagree with what it is that he believes in. Medicaid wasn't, I think in the long run, especially with some of the things that we're working on in terms of healthcare just in general in Virginia, in the long run, Medicaid is going to become a moot point. And that is the hope, and that's what we're working on. In fact, although on the surface this assembly session was kind of meh, some of the underlying issues that were being discussed were actually very exciting. For instance, at the beginning before the session, the Virginia Institute published a set of legislative models based on telemedicine, charity care, direct primary care. We had about, the Virginia Institute had about 7 different priorities that they had put out in legislative models in 3 different bills. And of those 7 priorities, 5 of them have passed.
Yep.
So not only that, but we do expect that all 5 of them will be signed. by the governor. So, I mean, very excited about that, and that's actually started to create a conversation in the state about other options outside of the kind of standard insurance model, health insurance model. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, we have two directions in healthcare, and one is single payer and the other is parallel market. And so we're in the process of kind of building the frameworks to get the system and the regulatory bodies out of the way of the parallel market, so that we can start creating this new way of getting your health care. And I mean, we actually made a surprising dent in it this year that we did not expect. We didn't expect to see that much movement.
When and I look at this, and you're right in this, because it's wonky to a degree. It doesn't get the camera time, but it's almost what I've heard from a lot of my friends in other states that do shows across the country, that when the Republicans took control of the House and the Senate and the presidency, and somebody said, "Okay, are you going to take down Obamacare?" and nobody seemed to have any sort of idea of what that would look like. Here we are, and at least what do they say? The states should be the incubators of democracy. We are in Virginia building that framework, so when Medicaid expansion does get taken down legislatively, there is a replacement for it, rather than a bunch of folks in expensive suits going hamina 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 hamina, or however Paul Ryan said it, which is what happened in Washington when all of a sudden they said, "What do you mean we won the presidency? Crap! What are we going to do now?"
Well, yeah, and whereas I think that the best possible option would be to kind of eliminate the expansion. Really, I think the best possible option would be to not only eliminate the year 1965, but also the year 1913 altogether. But just if we could just repeal both years, I think we would be better off. But what the hope is, at least from an economic standpoint, in terms of healthcare the economic possibilities inside the healthcare market, is that we can create a framework in such a way that the fact that Medicaid exists is not even relevant. And that's the direction we go. I mean, currently I've gone back to school, and I'm still working, doing everything that we do, but I'm doing a bunch of other stuff, and it's a pretty big money suck. So it's hard to afford health insurance. So I've given up on it. So instead, I have a direct primary contract, and I have a short-term health insurance to cover catastrophic care, and everything gets covered, and it's less than $200 a month. There are tons of options out there that are just more efficacious to healthcare, not health insurance. One of the things that we've been trying to do and have conversations with legislators, but with regular Virginians as well, is the understanding that health insurance does not equate to health care, which does not equate to health.
Right, exactly.
These things are three different things. And what we need to be concentrating on is what improves health. And that's what it is. And health insurance does not in any way equate to health.
And the better we grasp that, the less we need Medicaid expansion or any sort of plan. And funny enough, all of those insurance programs start to cost less. Caleb Taylor is the legislative advisor to Tertium Quids, on with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. I wanted to talk about the economy of Virginia, and in specifics what we could be facing. And I don't want to speak in specifics. We're not a political organization in as much as we campaign, nor would I want to be, because I think it gives us an opportunity. Let's say if a Chap Peterson has a particularly good economic bill, we can talk about it without feeling like we violated some trust. But that being said, there are an awful lot of candidates talking about guaranteed wages, guaranteed minimum wages. We already have a couple of members, or at least one member of the Democratic Socialist Party of Virginia that says, we need price controls and, higher minimum wages, and two or three candidates trying to overthrow or oust long-standing members of the House want to repeal and are campaigning on repealing right to work. As Venezuela has voted out the Chavez regime and the communism that has taken the second most natural resource-rich country in the Western Hemisphere to the brink of absolute economic collapse, why would Virginia, in any way, shape, or form, outside of pure pandering, want to be running towards Venezuela?
It comes down to this. You've got this part of this idea that, that's not real socialism, and that's amazingly silly. It's one of my favorite economists is Brian Kaplan, and one of his comments is, a lot of people say, well, that's not real socialism, and then a lot of other people on the opposite spectrum go, well, that's not real libertarianism or free entrepreneurialism, and then his comment is, well, you're right, it's not real free entrepreneurialism, and it's not real socialism. But the fact of the matter is that when we get close, when we reach almost free entrepreneurialism, everyone gets rich and the whole boat lifts. And if we get almost socialism, everyone dies. And it's this kind of basic reality that even incrementally, free enterprise makes the outcomes are better for the average Virginian or American or Venezuelan or anybody, human being, than any variation of the socialist ideal. Mm-hmm. Now, I understand I don't want to impugn upon every single socialist as if they're some kind of evil person that just wants to be in control. Ultimately, that's what it ends up being, but I have a number of communist and socialist friends who I have these discussions with often, that they truly do. They simply want to help people. The problem is what they want to accomplish won't actually accomplish that goal.
Well, it also strikes me that when I run into somebody, and that you're right, they truly want to help people, but it's based not on the uplifting belief that I want to help you achieve all the things you can achieve. It is that I want to help you survive because I don't believe you can. And that's what bothers me about the rank and file socialist mindset, is that there are only a certain number of people that have been gifted by the Creator with the intellectual heft to survive and manage things. And the rest of you just kind of need to, get behind us and push what we need you to push or pull what we need you to pull. And that's what bothers me on almost a theological level, Caleb.
No, I completely agree with you. And it's this idea that there is any such person, and you and I have talked about this before, not just in relative to theology, but in relative to the founding principles of this country, is this basic understanding that there is no such thing as the perfect leader, and there's no such thing as the perfect party and the perfect government system. There's no such thing as the uncorrupt powerful. It's not something that happens. Mm-hmm. And it's not just that, power corrupts absolutely, or absolute power corrupts absolutely, but a little bit of power corrupts a little bit.
Yeah.
And not only that, a little bit of power, or any level of power, draws in people who are already corrupt. So no matter where you go, the more power there is, the more the corrupt are drawn in, and the more that the people who started off with good ideals ultimately become corrupt. And it's inevitable. This is not something that can ever be stopped. It is a natural occurrence. Mm-hmm. So why would we give anybody, and I love you, Joe.
I love you,
But
man. You can't have my Bud Light, though.
I do, but in no way would I ever let you in charge of my life.
Right, and nor would I want you, and that's the thing.
Exactly.
Is that the concept Americana was that just make sure the lights work and the streets are paved. We'll agree that far, and to me, in a small degree, I see this as why we're $22 trillion in debt on a national scale, because we keep the federal government keeps trying to find creative ways to buy us off from our individual protections. Here's a bag of money I just printed. Let me run your schools. Here's a bag of money I just printed. Let me run your police departments or your investigative wings. Or here's a bag of money. Let me control your ports. And it's all things that the state should have been able to do, or the localities, and keeping our governing local and small. But we've sort of sold it out for fiat currency, sadly, at the end of the day, the money that has grown less and less valuable every time they print a new skid full of it.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I mean, this whole thing, the guaranteed, and I don't know, actually, I don't really know where this like cultural, like acceptance of the idea of anything being guaranteed has come from.
No.
I don't know where that has come from, because it's not actually like a long-standing tradition and in like the American worldview, that anything is guaranteed. In fact, I think if you go back and watch movies that are like one generation back, like even the movies like have conversations about nothing in life is guaranteed. That's something that we all kind of grew up listening to from Billy Crystal and stuff.
Nothing is
nowadays.
But if you listen to a fellow like a Bernie Sanders, and he starts talking about we are a wealthy nation, here's an educated man. Is he just pandering? Does he actually believe that we are a wealthy nation? Because I don't consider myself to have achieved the educational degrees that Bernie Sanders is, but I grasp the fact that we are a free nation full of prosperous people, not a wealthy nation. There are nations in the world like England where the Queen owns all the land and lets you live on it. Okay, you can say the Emirates are wealthy nations because there's the government owns everything, but we don't own anything as this country, and yet we almost nitwittedly, and I hate to apply that to somebody who's achieved the things that Bernie Sanders has, he must just be pandering to some, base that he thinks are triggered by this. But we're not a wealthy nation, not just because we have $22 trillion in debt, but because the government doesn't technically own anything.
Well, And we could have a more specific conversation about that, but I mean, really, I'm actually starting to see that idea, that kind of collectivism, and some people that are more angry about this whole situation refer to it as statism, but I tend to refer to it as collectivism. This idea that we are a collective here, and the problem is that it actually exists in both parties in kind of different flavors. And so, when I'm having conversations about immigration with my conservative friends, one of the things that they like to talk about is, if you wouldn't let people inside the border, would you let people inside your house? That kind of argument. And I think there are plenty of good arguments to have about restricting immigration or making sure that immigration is legal or whatnot. I'm sure there's plenty of arguments to have, but that's just not one of them. That's just a collectivist, like the nation owns the property. No, individuals own the property.
Yeah.
And individuals have the choice, not the government and not their neighbors. So it's just not a good argument to have. But what we're seeing, or what I have been seeing, and I really do believe that this is just kind of the last two generations, is that we're really our mindset is starting to become collectivist. So much so that regardless of which side of the aisle you're sitting on, you're starting to hear people have these discussions from the point of view of we as opposed to I.
Yeah.
And that's a major problem.
Sure. To take your example of the house, it's not whether I would let somebody into my house. Now it's become, will my neighbors let somebody into my house?
Yeah. So the conversation is in that regard is the private property versus public property. Well, we can't. Let's not conflate these two things. Mm-hmm. Let's have a real conversation about the benefits and problems with immigration, and not use these silly conflations of collectivist property versus individual property.
Right.
I want to have a real conversation about it. Rather than a conversation through memes.
or tweets. Caleb, we have to let you go. James Taylor from the Heartland Institute is up next. But this is not only, and this is what every time you and I talk on this program, people say, well, hold it. He's the legislative director. I say, yeah, that's the thing. That's why the Virginia Institute and Tertium Quids are not so much a think tank as a do tank. Because first we think it, then we do it. And I appreciate everything you do, Caleb. And again, tertiumquids.org. And we'll talk to you again very soon.
Appreciate you.